The most important thing in a world of super fighting mecha fortresses that can vaporize entire space colonies in the blink of an eye was a 15-year-old girl that called out her crush's name into empty air?
Heero! I am right over here, so come and kill me!
Yes, because without her, Gundam Wing would have collapsed under its own weight. But why? Watch to the end of the video and you'll learn about power, diplomacy, and how maybe the most underrated character that I've ever seen was so believably, masterfully developed. And the results speak for themselves, because she brought her franchise to a peak it's never seen again. Let's begin. Gundam Wing is kind of the red-headed stepchild among the Gundam fans I talked to today, and for reasons we'll get into shortly I can kind of see why, but the facts are still the facts. No other Gundam show has had a more important impact internationally. It was only a modest success in Japan, but a massive hit in the United States. And it wasn't even the first Gundam series released abroad, but it was the first to get a national broadcast in the American market. You could argue that would have given it an unfair advantage, but Gundam Wing's popularity can't be traced just to this first mover status, because during its initial run in 2000, it was the highest rated show not only on Toonami, where it was beating Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon in all age categories, but on Cartoon Network as a whole. It thrilled a generation of young teenagers, myself among them, and that thrill likely won't come back for today's young teenagers watching a Gundam series, because none have rivaled Wing's mainstream impact since. And it's a bit funny because, as I was just talking about, this show was far from perfect. It had a lot of flaws. The constant recycled animations were the least of its problems. For one, there was ridiculous plot armor. Randoms constantly got blown up, but when it came to major characters, enemies constantly missed, hit on important spots in a mobile suit, or their mobile suits just survived because that's what the plot demanded. A lot of the dialogue was also melodramatic, and it skirted too much toward breaking the Zelda rule and letting you know that what you were seeing wasn't real. But for all of these problems, Gundam Wing has an incredible story. And that's why it was beating Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, because its story was simply better, even if you didn't recognize that at the time. And that was mostly thanks to the much maligned, but more misunderstood, Relena Peacecraft. She was not only the best character in this show, without her, the entire thing would have fallen apart. But before we get to why, if you're interested in becoming a channel member, the link is in the description. If you become one, you can see these videos early, get your name featured in these videos, and get these cool little boxing glove badges, so go check it out. If you're like me, you would have been first drawn to this show because of the cool mechas and the big explosions they made. But that stuff gets old fast. I lean more towards the Triple H approach to storytelling, where you should make big action moments mean something and not just have explosions to have explosions. Although the fights in Gundam Wing are cool, they aren't what made this show so important and impactful. The real draw to this show, after you see it for the first time or if you're above the age of 16, is in the way it progressively raises the stakes of its action through constant shifting alliances. The plot is very deep for something you might ordinarily think of as a show targeted to teenage boys. There are different interest groups and factions within those interest groups that each have their own values and goals. For example, the Romefeller Foundation and its Oz military wing is the major antagonist for about 3/4 of the show. The creators smartly made this organization a group of snooty and out-of-touch aristocrats that don't care much about the rest of the world as long as they rule it. And as the curtain rises, they're planning to show that sentiment in the ultimate way. Gundam Wing, therefore, is a realistic look at international relations and world order. The show starts with the world forced into a confederation under an organization called the United Earth Sphere Alliance, and in theory, this order has ended the normal state of anarchy in the international system, where sovereign states behave according to their interests and can only be constrained by greater force. If you want to see more about this stuff and realist international relations theory, you can go check out my Claymore video when you're done with this one because I talk a lot more about it there. Anyway, the nations of the world are part of the alliance, which didn't hesitate to act violently against dissenters. Meanwhile, the space colonies that orbit Earth have been put under alliance military occupation for reasons that are never explained, but the show didn't have to. Part of the reason the alliance is so successful is because the Romefeller Foundation gives it financial and military aid in the form of mechas called mobile suits, as we've talked about before. But even this sort of world order isn't enough. The Romefeller Foundation thinks it needs to rule directly to get things right. Like usual, powerful people want more power. So in the first episode, 5 Gundams, overpowered mobile suits, were sent to Earth by rebel factions within the orbiting space colonies. The pilots' names are Heero Yui, Duo Maxwell, Troa Barton, Quatre Rababa Winner, and of course Wu Fei Chang. Their goal was to retaliate against the occupation of space and destroy Oz, which assassinated the leader of the colonies 20 years earlier, not so coincidentally named Heero Yui. But it's not so simple as this, because Oz is embedded in the Alliance's forces as its special operations arm, which creates the seeds of a tragedy of the Gundam's own making. For a while, the Gundam's attacks were succeeding, but these acts of terrorism provided Romefeller with the perfect chance to implement its plans. The leader of Oz, Treize Kushrenada, masterminded a coup to destroy the dovish officers in the Alliance who put forward an agenda of disarmament and an end to military rule in the colonies. So in other words, the Gundams did the bidding of their enemies and destroyed the very people that could have bettered the colonies they were supposedly fighting for. And I love this as a plot point because not only did it put the heroes on the spot, it showed that when you try to overthrow a regime with violence, more often you only get a worse one. That was what usually happened in history, and it happened in Gundam Wing too. So the Foundation overthrew the Alliance in a military coup and took control of the planet. But to keep its control, it needed to bring the vast resources and industrial capacity of the space colonies into its war machine. And fortunately for Romefeller, the Alliance harshly oppressed the colonies, so they were easy marks for diplomatic flattery. The Oz people, the Foundation people, were greeted as liberators, despite some dire warnings by people who knew better. The colonies fell into line thanks in no small part to the diplomatic efforts of Treize's second-in-command, Lady Un, who might be the second most interesting character in this series because of her split personality as both a ruthless soldier and a warm-hearted and astute diplomat. Anyway, once again the Gundams were powerless to change the course of these events. All of Romefeller agreed with this part of the plan, but division set in afterward, and it was a division well ahead of the show's time, because the higher-ups in the Foundation now wanted to use autonomous weapons called mobile dolls as the backbone of the Foundation's next-generation military. But Treize thought that this was dangerous and detestable because it removed any real human meaning or cost from warfare. But Treize failed to convince the higher-ups in the Foundation, led by Duke Dermail and the chief engineer Suvorov, to change course, so he resigned and was imprisoned. And that created a splinter faction from the Foundation that was loyal to Treize, and the show's main characters now found themselves sharing a common interest with their former enemy. Toward the end of the show, an armed rebellion overthrew Romefeller's order in space, and now the Gundam pilots who were originally supposed to fight for the colonies found themselves having to fight the radicals from home that became the armed power there, and they were on the side of the Foundation. So this is all incredibly realistic, and it might be hard to keep track of until you've watched the series a few times. And I like that because this is how it is in international relations and the affairs of state. Former enemies are often forced to make common cause to balance against a bigger threat. But this sort of amoral realism, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, isn't the best way to create a compelling narrative, because it's important to give your audience ways to visualize themselves as potentially being like the focus characters. That's what keeps the human brain's attention. The famous cognitive scientist Steven Pinker tells us why. Quote, "Fictional narratives supply us with a mental catalog of the fatal conundrums we might face someday and the outcomes of strategies we could deploy in them. What are the options if I were to suspect that my uncle killed my father, took his position, and married my mother? If my hapless older brother got no respect in the family, are there circumstances that might lead him to betray me? The cliché that life imitates art is true, because the function of some kinds of art is for life to imitate it." Basically, if you can't see yourself like the focus character, your brain doesn't care. The plot and circumstances can be extreme, but there needs to be something familiar there. The Gundam pilots sort of serve in that capacity, but Gundam Wing decided to take a more interesting twist in presenting these guys as usually being victims of the constantly changing political winds. It becomes clear early on that their actions matter, but despite having the world's most advanced weapons, they lack the power to be the kind of change agents they want to be. And I really like this because it showed that being able to cause physical damage isn't always the most effective form of power. As we mentioned, it's often the opposite, leading to worse circumstances than before. This is a brave way to go for a show like this, but it left the Gundam pilots as less than compelling main characters. They're less change agents than they are bystanders. Powerful ones, but still bystanders riding fortune's wheel. They didn't need to be. The creators could have shown their actions as having a more decisive impact, but that wasn't the case. They just blew stuff up. And just blowing stuff up isn't enough to make you see yourself as like these characters. Those are just things that happen. That's not a story. The narrative would have failed if it didn't have a focus character that could act as a center of gravity that this plot, with all its constant changing alliances, orbits around. And it does, but that character came in the least likely place, in the form of a 15-year-old girl. On the surface, Relena has no extraordinary qualities. She's not a crack pilot. She doesn't even seem that smart, at least at first. She's rich, but other than that, she's an ordinary and bratty girl looking for attention from her father. In other words, she's the perfect starting point for an extraordinary character. We meet extraordinary people as soon as Gundam Wing starts, like the Gundam pilots Zechs and Tallgeese. Her being so ordinary means she has the most room for growth. That's how you can quickly see a character as potentially being like you. And even in this so-called annoying part of her story arc, you can't fail to notice her. Relena has charisma, and that will be very important for later on. Relena's first major arc shows her as being obsessed with Heero, the show's supposed main character. She tried to invite him to her birthday party, only for him to tear the invitation up and threaten to kill her. So you'd think she'd want to stay as far away from him as possible after that, but it wasn't the case. She followed him around, stood down the barrel of his gun, learned his secret as a Gundam pilot, and called his name out into empty air. A lot of people think she's annoying, as I just said, but at this point in the story, she's supposed to be. Relena behaves like you would expect a 15-year-old girl of some means to behave. But there's one important thing you see about her right away. In risking her life to chase after Heero, Relena already displayed extraordinary courage and the power of the human will, the power of someone who won't take no for an answer in going after what she wants. These are aspirational qualities, and they're much easier to cheer for than anything we've seen from the Gundam pilots or their antagonists at that point. But then this ordinary girl learned she might not be so ordinary. Her father, the Alliance's vice foreign minister, was assassinated, but it turned out he's not really her father. In his dying breath, he told her that she's of royal blood, the daughter of the world's most famous ruling family that argued against militarism. The Alliance destroyed them and their country, the Sank Kingdom, for this, but they didn't destroy her. She made it out. Now, Relena doesn't do much with this information at first. She tries to get on with life as she knows it, but the world is changing fast, and she's looking for revenge, because she knew who her father's killer was. So now her brother Milliardo, who disguises himself as the elite Oz pilot Zechs Marquise, liberates their homeland, the Sand Kingdom, from the Alliance. But as he does so, he confesses he's unfit to keep their parents' torch because of his lifestyle as a soldier. Relena can take it up though. Shortly after, Relena showed her extraordinary courage and willpower again when she tried to shoot her father's assassin, Lady Un. She failed, but once again it was a demonstration of the sheer power of the human will and just how much power can come to you when you decide to take your fate into your own hands. This was one of the most powerful people in the world, and a 15-year-old girl almost took her down. Relena was about to get caught, but then met her brother's trusted ally Lucrezia Noin, who installed her as the leader of the Sank Kingdom. So up until now, Relena was also on Fortune's wheel. She waited for her father to pay attention to her, she was reactive when Heero caught her attention, and she played along with the revelation that she was the heir to the Peacecraft family, resulting in her move to the Sank Kingdom. Relena had little choice in most of these events, even though we saw her trying to break free from them. But from this point on, Relena was no longer a passive player in the world. She was truly the only character in Gundam Wing that can say that. But before we move on to Relena the Princess, Super Chats are enabled, so if you guys want to send me a little love, you can do so, and I'll make sure to respond to all of your Super Chat comments in depth. The next time we saw her, Relena told off the Romefeller Foundation for their oppressive militarism, and this didn't mean much at the time, but she showed she wasn't afraid to stand up to the most powerful people in the world again, but this time not in a terrorist sort of way, but rather in a public political forum. And that is the distinction that would make the crucial difference. One thing I liked about this episode, episode 14, is that the transformation clearly isn't complete. Relena might now have the title of princess and the sovereignty of a nation, but that doesn't mean she just steps into the role. There was a sloppiness to her execution at Romefeller, and then 2 episodes later she defied an armed Oz search party to try and break up a fight between Heero and her brother in Antarctica. There was a lot of courage there again, and courage is a virtue. But remember what Aristotle said about finding the mean between excess and deficiency, and I talk about this concept more in my Hajime no Ippo video. An excess of courage becomes recklessness, and that's what Relena was showing through the series to that point, if we're being honest. That's one reason why a lot of people don't like her. She clearly still wasn't ready for prime time, for what history was starting to demand of her, and that's good writing. You can't just change her overnight. Gundam Wing's writer Katsuyuki Sumizawa introduced a good technique to make those changes though. After the battle in Antarctica, Gundam Wing's action shifts to outer space. Romefeller has successfully become the hegemon on Earth. That's when it launched the second part of its plan to secure the resources of outer space to ensure it stayed that way. Again, the Gundam pilots tried to stop this, but they're unable to change the course of history. They're history takers rather than history makers. Romefeller succeeded in all of its objectives in space and sent its mobile dolls to Earth. With Treize gone, it didn't seem like anyone could stop Romefeller at that time. Wrong. We finally saw Relena again in episode 29. She's in a meeting, and it turned out that a good number of influential people on Earth didn't like what Romefeller was doing either, but they had no figure to rally around to try to shape the course of events. While the Gundam pilots struggled futilely in space, Relena started to become this figure. When she spoke with tact and poise. She still had that spark of courage and desire for justice, but you can see these things becoming tempered and disciplined, coming closer to Aristotle's mean. Relena grew into her role fast. Maybe a little too fast if you think about it objectively because only a few months passed, but since she wasn't seen for a while, and because she's smart and resourceful, it still felt natural. As princess, Relena offered refuge to anyone who wanted to escape the wars, including Heero and Quatre, plus the Treize faction that rebelled against Romefeller. Now Romefeller was starting to become afraid of her growing influence, so they called her in again to answer some questions, most notably about her brother, who turned his back on Oz after he and Heero had their battle in Antarctica. It's in this scene that you can see how far she came in such a short time. In episode 14, she was reckless and didn't have a plan for what she was saying. She just disliked Romefeller's authoritarianism. She still does, but this time in episode 33, she was poised all while remaining unintimidated. She even suggested that Romefeller should use the Sank Kingdom as the model for a peaceful world order rather than the militaristic rule it had wanted. So the meeting doesn't end with such a happily ever after, of course, but you see how much of a threat Relena became to Romefeller despite their overwhelming military power. Again, look at episode 14 and then episode 29 and 33 as a side-by-side. Relena is even still wearing the same clothes, but this isn't the same reckless girl. Even an assassination attempt disguised as a happy accident didn't scare her. You can see that unlike everyone else in the series, Relena wasn't constrained by the history book that Romefeller wanted to write. She was an alternate author. Duke Dermail particularly hated this. He saw no option but to attack the Sank Kingdom under the pretext of, quote, protecting Relena from the armed factions that were supposedly gathering around her under the guise of being refugees. If that sounds like bullshit, it's because it obviously was. And it might sound like a convenient excuse for aggression you'd find in international relations in any setting. But here's where Relena goes from being just potential to being a true history maker. Before we get to the next section though, if you enjoy my content and you want to see how these scripts are written and get all the sources I used in them, you can buy them on Ko-fi, or you can send me a small donation there. I'll love you for it either way. The link is in the description. Rather than see her people and friends suffer fighting for her, including Heero, Relena decided to surrender herself and her kingdom to Oz. Her speech, where she said she'd rather do that than see her country being an excuse for battles, was broadcast all over the world and won her a lot of supporters. Surprisingly, Duke Dermail was among them. His support was cynical though, because while the Romefeller Foundation was succeeding in its military objectives, It was, as you might expect, extremely unpopular. It was winning the war, but wasn't in a position to win the peace. This is a good time to look at the concept of charismatic authority. And first, we need to see how the famous German sociologist Max Weber distinguished between power and authority. Quote, "The element of legitimacy is vital to the notion of authority and is the main means by which authority is distinguished from the more general concept of power. Power can be exerted by the use of force or violence. Authority, by contrast, depends on the acceptance by subordinates of the right of those above them to give them orders or directives. Charismatic authority is often the most lasting of regimes because the leader is seen as infallible and any action against him will be seen as a crime against the state. Charismatic leaders eventually develop a cult of personality, often not by their own doing." So Treize had this kind of charismatic authority. If you watch the show, you will clearly see elements of a cult of personality around him. But there's a big drawback to charismatic authority. It's the most unstable kind. When the leader goes, the framework of legitimate power goes too. This is why constitutional regimes have tended to outcompete personality-based ones throughout history, a concept that the Greek historian Polybius first outlined when he talked about why the Roman Republic defeated Carthage and the successor states of Alexander the Great, and you can see plenty examples of this in our time too. The Rockefeller Foundation had a lot of military power, but it never built a truly stable edifice of authority. That was its problem. I should quote the introduction to a Yale lecture on the subject here. Charismatic authority, unlike traditional authority, is a revolutionary and unstable form of authority. Weber borrows the religious term of charisma and extends its use to a secular meaning. Audiences and followers believe that charismatic leaders have a close connection to a divine power, have exceptional skills, or are exemplary in some way. Charismatic leaders promise change in the future for the society and also change people's attitudes and values. In this way, charismatic authority is revolutionary in a way that traditional and legal rational authority are not. However, charisma is unstable and deteriorates if the leader cannot produce the changes he promises or when he confronts the contradictory logics and demands of the other types of authority. There are particular ways, including search, revelation, designation, or heredity, that charismatic successors are identified, but transferring charismatic authority is difficult and not always successful. So you can see Rockefeller's problem now. As soon as Treize resigned, it had no source of authority. Duc de Mail couldn't fulfill that role. But now he understood that Relena could, and that was his plan. He brought Relena back to Rockefeller headquarters and offered to make her the queen of a newly established world nation. Relena accepted after a bit of psychological coercion, but this was the move that would prove Duc de Mail's downfall. Because to his horror, Relena quickly became more popular in the Foundation than he was. She had a charismatic presence he simply could not compete with. So when Relena advocates to disarm Oz and move toward a peaceful world order, he finds himself without allies to oppose her. Just like that, Relena changed Rockefeller and moved toward the end of Oz as a military force, something the Gundam pilots never came close to achieving. The fact that Relena did all of this in her darkest hour, when she needed to surrender and expected some sort of confinement, is what makes this so remarkable. And it's also realistic because in wartime like this, charismatic figures are often more influential in dictating the course of events than developments on the battlefield. But Relena came too late to prevent the situation in space from deteriorating. By now, the colonies understandably were frustrated with Romefeller treating them as resource farms. With the end of Treize's regime, Lady Un also disappeared from the scene, and her charismatic authority with her. Without her, Duke Dermail's chief engineer Tubarov, the mind behind the mobile dolls, also took political control, and well, let's just say he's even nastier. So an armed militia group called the White Fang staged a successful coup and destroyed or took over most of Oz's military infrastructure in space, including the giant battleship Libra. Duke Dermail then left Earth to take command in space, hoping to get his power back by becoming a military hero, but he's soon killed in action. The cynic in you might think, great, right? With Duke Dermail and Tubarov gone, the hardline elitist militants in Romefeller are also gone, and Relena is now free to patch things up between a unifying Earth and the colonies. But you'd be wrong, because from White Fang's perspective, things weren't so simple. You don't forget the sort of oppressive treatment Earth gave you for so long just because there's a regime change. This was incredibly realistic and well done, and I particularly loved how the White Fang recruited Relena's brother Zechs as its leader, because Zechs, who then went by his real name Relena Peacecraft again, feels much the same. His sister might be the queen now, but does that mean he can forget all that happened to his homeland and just get on with it? No, peace shouldn't be that easy, he says. Also, this arc encompassed the best episode in the series called Crossfire at Barge, episode 41. Watch that episode, you will like the action, and it was action that meant something because the stakes were high. It's an important episode in another way, too, because Treize came back and led another coup. Relena might have tried to negotiate a peace, but to Treize, a hawkish stance was necessary, especially after the White Fang used the battleship Libra to fire on Earth from orbit and produced a blast much more intense than the greatest nuke that ever was. So now Relena was out. For the first time since the beginning of the series, she was an ordinary civilian. You'd think that her story is over now, and when it comes to being a history maker, at this point it is. But that doesn't mean she accepts what's happening. She did something that resembled what she did at the beginning of the series. She went into the danger zone all on her own and tried to convince her brother to stand down in person. But unlike the beginning of the series, she now had a lifetime's worth of experience in diplomacy condensed into a span of 8 months. Her rhetoric toward Milliardo is impassioned and reasonable, but she had no chance of changing his mind. So now here's where the Gundam pilots finally become history makers, which came by ironically siding with their former enemies. They and their supporters crashed their ship into Libra, destroyed the mobile doll operating system on board, and Wu Fei killed Treize. Treize basically let him do it because he believed his death and the destruction of all weapons on Earth as a result of this battle would lead to peace. This is not something you can conceive of in the beginning of the series, and it shows how influential Relena really was. The moderate colony leaders now finally voiced their mandate that the White Fang's demands were to be rejected, and that the militant group didn't speak for the colonies. Now, without any legitimacy, Milliardo was the only member of the White Fang who kept fighting. He finally appeared to sacrifice his life like Treize by destroying a part of Libra that kept falling toward Earth, but it wasn't enough. The series ended with the climatic moment of Heero destroying the last fragment of Libra as it entered Earth's atmosphere, and he prevented it from striking the planet like a big comet. The last scene took place a few months later, when he secretly gave a birthday gift to the now Vice Foreign Minister Relena, who took her father's old job. And she might only be 16, but no one argues she's too young for the job. Why would they? And of course she ripped up the card just like he did to hers a year earlier, but this time with a smile on her face. But Relena did one last thing that made her extraordinary, and it's likely the most extraordinary thing of all. She might have been ousted, but everyone respected her and knew how influential she was in ending the wars and creating a new peaceful world order between Earth and space. This is only speculation on my part, but if she wanted to, Relena probably could have become queen again. Her charismatic authority remained immense, as we will soon see. Usually after such revolutionary changes in politics like those seen in Gundam Wing, the victorious leader takes power, much like Treize did at the start of the series. Julius Caesar, his nephew the Emperor Augustus, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, the list of examples goes on. But Relena took a page out of George Washington's playbook. She stayed in politics but chose not to become a supreme leader. Vice Foreign Minister was good enough for her. And we saw the result of this in Endless Waltz. I'm not a huge fan of the movie, but you can see the changes that had taken place in just a year. There's an attempt at a military coup and to install Treize's daughter as the figurehead of a new military regime from the colonies, but Relena was still so important that the conspirators saw the need to kidnap her as a way to further legitimize their actions. But the conspirators didn't plan to encounter a stable regime. Sometime between the end of the series and Endless Waltz, the world replaced a charismatic authority structure with a constitutional one. The Gundam pilots played their part in foiling the conspirators' plans, but the most important thing was the people themselves, who rose up in the defense of their new constitutional government. Relena encouraged this, but she never got to finish her speech. The people did this mostly on their own, with a little help from Dorothy Catalonia. The conspirators didn't want to fire on the people to take power, especially when Lady Une reappeared and told them what Treize would have wanted, so they threw their weapons down and peace was restored again. The Gundams were destroyed because they weren't necessary anymore. When you see Relena at the end of the series and in Endless Waltz, and compare her with how she was at the start, you see how much she's grown. It's more character growth than anyone else in Gundam Wing by far, and she did far more good for the world, all without firing a shot. That's what makes her so powerful. That's why Heero said that he was nothing compared to her. I'm not sure if this is the case anymore, but there used to be a lot of people who ignored this and just said that Relena is annoying. I think these people were mostly Slash fans who wanted to pair Heero and Duo up with each other, and Relena obviously got in the way of that, but honestly, that undercuts her character more than they think. Yes, Heero and Relena had romantic chemistry as the series went on, but it was artfully subdued. They were two kids in the midst of a war. They're tiptoeing around each other in that way, not quite sure how to feel, having to sacrifice exploring those feelings because of the chaos going on around them, is obvious, and it feels consistent with everything else. It's also great because it allows Relena's character to shine. Heero might have been a motivation early on, but the good Relena does isn't because of him. Her greatness isn't because of him. It's all because of her, and it's because of her that this series shines. If the writers wanted to, they could have made this a different series, focusing on the Gundam pilots, making change by force and being badass, but they didn't do that. They decided to go with something different. The badass robots failed to make the change they want. Instead, it comes from the most unexpected place where the weak become strong. And honestly, it makes for a much more compelling and memorable story, because all wars are first and foremost political. To end a war like the one you see in Gundam Wing, you need an inspiring and psychologically astute political force to make it feel real. That's Relena, and Relena shows that when you have the right focus character for your setting that people can relate to, even if it's not the most obvious one, maybe because it's not the most obvious one, and when you take the time to develop that character properly, you can make magic. But do you agree with me? Is Relena the best part about Gundam Wing, and would it have fallen apart without her? Don't forget to hit the like button and let me know in the comments, because each one helps this video to rank against the algorithm, the real Romefeller we're dealing with. And if you like my content, which I assume you do because you watched this far, please do that right now because it helps me so much. If you want to get these videos early and get your name featured in these videos, become a channel member or a supporter on Patreon, and here you all are. So that's all for now. If there's a certain story you want me to analyze in the future, let me know in the comments. We'll see you on the next one. Until then, keep writing and keep fighting.